I'm very happy to be here today in Tokyo to talk to you a little bit more about the creation of the world of the Division 2. Perfect. So we're going to start off the presentation. And the presentation is called Building an Immersive World. And I'm going to be telling you about three things. The first thing is all about world logic. And world logic at Ubisoft is how the world is built and how it makes sense within itself. The second thing is about world building, how we actually took the world of Washington, D.C., transformed it and recreated it within the world of the Division 2. And of course, the world and the world being built is just a small part of it. We have to make it immersive, interesting for you and us to play inside it. So the first part is all about world logic. And world logic is really answering the two questions of why Washington, D.C., and why 7 months after the events of Black Friday in New York that were depicted in the first game. So before picking Washington, D.C., we considered many other cities, of which Seattle was one of them, New Orleans was another. Many other cities were also considered. But we decided on Washington, D.C. for a few reasons. And one of those was variety. Variety is very important to us because as beautiful as New York was, in the wintertime, it was one or two different types of environment. In Washington, D.C., we get a lot more variety within it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. The second thing is contrast. Now, contrast is very important to the Division brand. Think of contrast being the difference between the winter happy holiday of the Division 1 contrasted with the disease that has ravaged the city. So we decided to set the Division 2 in summer in a hot, heat wave-ridden, flooded Washington, D.C. to give us that sort of contrast that we didn't have in the first game. And Washington, D.C. was also wonderful for us because it meant the stakes, the motivation, and the importance of the mission were that much higher. So in the first game, civilians were reacting to the situation. They were suffering. But 7 months later, people are starting to rebuild. People are starting to get a grip on the situation. And that's very important for us too. Perfect. Washington, D.C. is also home to the Division. There is only one person who can tell the Division as a unit what to do, and that is the Commander-in-Chief, the President of the United States. So with the Division 2, we're going back home. So now the second part is all about world building and how much research that we do and how we put that research within the game. So before the next part, there's a little video that I'd like to show you, which is a summary of the trip, one of the research trips that we did to Washington, D.C., where we spoke to specialists, special forces, politicians, researchers, first responders, policemen, firemen, and they gave us their idea of what would happen in Washington, D.C. if everything turned bad, if there was a virus released. And this video has only ever been seen within the development team. It's the first time we show it publicly. Thank you very much. Now, some of the people in that video had to hide their faces because they don't want their identity known. They're special operatives or ex-special operatives who taught us a lot about weapon handling and movement. His name was Bob. Bob. So, one of the things that we really wanted to nail was the sound of Washington, D.C. But Washington, D.C. is a very active city, so our sound team went into the streets in the middle of the night on the weekend to see the sounds that they could capture in wide streets, in small streets, and in places where you had a little bit more nature. So the sound that you will hear is very much authentic Washington, D.C. But it wasn't quiet enough for us, so we organized a second trip to capture the sound of a completely abandoned city in Chernobyl.
収録しなければいけませんでした。
Now, research is one thing, but building the city is something completely different. And to build the city, we had to do something that was even more accurate than the first game.
ということでもあります。
And to do this, we improved Snowdrop, our game engine, and we allowed it to be able to import GIS and LiDAR data. And that's the type of data that you find in GPSs in cars.
した
And what that allows us to do is, for the first time in a Ubisoft game, recreate a city one-to-one. That means exactly the same in real life than it is in the video game. But of course, it wouldn't be a Division game if we didn't transform it. And the transformation comes from the virus being let loose and collapse happening within the city. So here you have the beautiful Washington, D.C. metro that you may recognize from House of Cards. But of course, in our world, that has been completely transformed. It's been flooded, the train has been derailed, and there are many secrets to uncover in these areas.
ればなりませんでした。
Now, this street is the street right next to the White House. Why it's interesting for us to look at is that after 7 months of nobody taking care of it, the vegetation has grown, cars have been crashed, things haven't been cleaned up at all. It's not post-apocalyptic because the vegetation isn't everywhere, but it's starting to expand.
表現しました。
And here is one of the streets that I like the most. It's a street within Georgetown. And in our transformation, of course, you can see the remnants of the contagion of the virus being here, the rolls of tarp, the car that's being covered in bird shit, the vegetation that's overgrown, the trash that hasn't been collected.
いう形になっています。
So we've seen the research. We've seen how we recreate things with perfect fidelity thanks to our tools. But how do we build an immersive experience? What are the secrets to making the world of the Division 2 even more interesting and engaging than the Division 1?
いただきたいと思います。
So the first thing is to show you the variety of the different environments that we have in our world. To start off with suburbs. And here we have Georgetown. Georgetown is a very rich area in Washington, D.C., and the people there had the means to escape before the virus really took hold.
住んでいました。
But everything was abandoned at that moment. So you can still see traces of Christmas trees, of decorations, their goods, their precious valuables still remaining in their homes because they just didn't have time to pack anything.
になっています。
The second environment, which is brand new for the Division, is nature. And nature was such a pleasure for us on the team because we're so used to doing things that are clinical and clean and like a city, that doing something in nature was a real breath of fresh air.
した。
The third environment is residential. Now, New York only had two environments, residential and commercial. How did we transform this in a different way for Washington? Well, the 6 months, the 7 months has changed this area. The trash isn't intact anymore. Everything's starting to melt in the sun, and the atmosphere is very, very different. The next environment is commercial. Commercial was the second environment that we did in New York City. But here, it still has a lot of secrets. A lot of the stores have been looted, but there are still some stores that are not looted, and they'll be able to contain the resources that we desperately need to help the civilians establishing settlements. Now, the next environment is governmental. Of course, as you know, Washington, D.C. is a capital city. So its architecture reflects that. Big buildings that want to communicate power. And that's one of the contrasts that we want to explore. The city built on power and about power that has lost its power. And the last environment is, of course, the National Mall. Now, this stretches from the Lincoln Memorial to the Capitol, two of the most famous buildings in Washington, D.C. And it contains all of the museums, all of the monuments, and a lot of the different landmarks that we associate with this great city. Now again, this is the map that we'll have with just some of the landmarks, some of the key locations, the iconic locations of Washington, D.C. that we've recreated. This map is around 20% bigger than the map in the Division 1, Midtown Manhattan. And of course, these locations are locations that we're going to use for missions, for side missions, for exploration. So for example, yes, you will be able to go into the Lincoln Memorial, and there will be a mission there. Roosevelt Island, which is one of the nature areas that we have in the game, has been completely transformed as well. Because it's isolated, it was perfect for a quarantine. What happened there? You'll have to discover it when the game comes out.
重要なエリアでもあります。
Of course, what recreation of Washington, D.C. would be complete without the White House. And the White House has been completely transformed. It's been half destroyed, and it'll be part of your mission to get it back up and running.
ではあります。
And last location that I want to talk about today is the Air and Space Museum. This is one of the most popular museums in the world. But in our world, it's been completely transformed. It was an armory where the government stored weapons and munitions. And of course, that makes it very attractive to not only the division, but all the factions running around DC.
興味があるということです。
So finally, to conclude, we consider Washington, D.C. as one of the main characters of the game. And that's thanks to our faithful recreation of the city, more variety in the environments, and of course, the transformation of all these icons. And to finish and to thank you, we have a little trailer of the game that asks the question, if this is the most important and well-defended city in America, how could we have lost it?
よく見てください。
How could this have happened here? Of all the capitals, of all the nations on Earth, none more vigilant, safeguarded, prepared. Was it vanity? Bad luck? Or something more sinister? One thing is beyond question. This is where we push back. This is our defining moment. If we fail, our nation falls. We are the free world's last line of defense.
Thank you very much for your time.
ありがとうございました。
Do you want to do a Q&A?
In the data for Division 1. Now, can you tell me a vague schedule when we are having
Very vague, early next year.
anything about Dark Zone?
There will be a dark zone with a lot of improvements from the first game. But in December, we'll be revealing much more about the dark zone and how we've transformed it.
So you kind of get it, right? He loves to play Division 1 and he's keen on knowing what's Aaron Keener doing in Division 2.
Aaron Keener will be a part of the Division 2, for sure. But if I told you, it would spoil it for everyone. So it's a secret, and we'll have to discover together in March.
Okay, he was a big fan of Division 1 and he liked to know, well, there's a lot of factions in the Division 1 too. What kind of faction would it be, in the Division 2 who appeared?
So the first faction that we've revealed are the True Sons. These are bullies, people who bullied you around at school, who have weapons, who have equipment, who think of themselves as the new military. But obviously they want to run the country and rule the country in a way that is not acceptable. And that's the first faction. The other factions we're going to reveal very soon as well.